Hi everyone, my name is Cynthia. Let's talk books. Today I'm here to talk about a book that I was able to read via an e-arc on NetGalley, an advanced reader's copy on NetGalley, and it is Sister Mother Warrior by Vanessa Riley. I loved Vanessa Riley's first historical fiction novel, and so as soon as I saw that she had a second one coming out, I immediately wanted to read it, and I'm so grateful that I was able to read it before its release date. And I just cannot tell you how important books like this is. It is a fictionalized version of the Haitian Revolution, and really one aspect of the Haitian Revolution. One of the things that becomes really clear the minute you start studying any history of the Haitian Revolution is the deep complexities within this history. And so it is a big task for any fiction writer to take on the subject of the Haitian Revolution. And Vanessa Riley, I think, ultimately does a really excellent job of doing that here. Now, one of the main projects that Vanessa Riley takes on here is telling the story of the Haitian Revolution, not through the eyes of the men, because even though the Haitian Revolution needs a lot more attention and needs to be studied a lot more in school, when it often is told through the eyes of the male leaders of the Haitian Revolution. But the tricky thing here is that women were central to the Haitian Revolution, just like they were to the American Revolution and to the French Revolution. And as more and more of the Haitian history comes out, women are still being marginalized in the way that that history is told. And so what Riley wanted to do was focus on two of the women that were central in this story. So we're following these two main perspectives: Marie-Claire Bonheur, who actually, you can look this up on Wikipedia. It's not a spoiler because it's just history. She ends up being one of the, the empress of Haiti for a time. And then Grand Toya, who was one of the main advisors for Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And so what we're really doing then is centering these stories of two women that were a key part, not just of the Haitian Revolution, but of Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Right, so we do get to see him there. I want to talk a little bit about the history, because one of the things Riley does is center the story of slavery. Right, this is a key part of telling the story of the Haitian Revolution, is the brutality of enslavement. And so for a good chunk of the story, we are in a period in which slavery exists, in which Jean-Jacques Dessalines is a slave, Grand Toya is a slave, but the story begins much earlier. Riley actually chooses to start the story in West Africa with Grand Toya, who, when we begin following her, she is not an enslaved. She's a young girl. This is a fictionalized version, so this is how Riley imagines her story to begin, in a West African village where her mother was kind of a healer. And then they get raided by the Doheny tribe, and most of the people that Grand Toya knows ends up dying. She, however, gets chosen to become one of the Doheny warriors who protect the king, and we get to see her going through her training. But we also get to see how Africans form part of the slave trade. Some people like to come online and talk about how Africans participate in the slave trade like that's some sort of gotcha. It's not. It's just, it's there. It's part of the history. It does not mean that, it does not lessen the culpability of Europeans in the slave trade when we talk about African involvement. Europeans couldn't have engaged in the slave trade on their own. They needed some African participation, and in fact they really come to dominate that economy and really force West Africans to engage in the slave trade. Otherwise there would be no way of making significant money in West Africa. Before I get carried away into my and give a lecture of that history, I want to talk about the themes. So we get to see a lot of the brutality in slavery, but we also get to see beautiful human relationships and difficult human relationships, and that's one of the main things that stood out to me in Vanessa Riley's story here. One of the main themes that the title tells us is sisterhood. We see different groups of sisters throughout the story. how they experience the same things in very different ways, how their dreams and expectations shape their actions, and also dictate to some extent the actions of siblings. And I thought that was really beautiful. In fact, for about a third to a half of the book, there's a third perspective in the story. That would be Marie Claire's mother, and so we get to see kind of the story of her family via her, going back to her formerly enslaved mother and plantation owner and enslaver father. And colorism, how colorism affects not just society but within families, and how the pressures of who to marry, why, and how the defiance of those norms plays out is really, really interesting. I happen to have two sisters, so I really will always appreciate when these sister stories are told and told beautifully the way they are in this particular story. Another theme is that of motherhood. Motherhood plays a really important part. Most of the women in the story are mothers in one way or another. Grantoya never physically delivers children, but she mothers a lot of children, and I actually really, really appreciated that kind of depiction of motherhood, because I feel like that's the kind of motherhood I've engaged in. I don't have any children that I have birthed, but I am the oldest in an immigrant family. I have mothered my siblings to some extent. I'm also a teacher, and so sometimes some of my students require a little bit of mothering. I try to not do too much of that because that can be problematic in the teaching profession. But you know, a lot of us engage in some sort of parenting that it does not involve children we actually birthed, and Grantoya is very much a mother. She takes on the role of mother, and she brings that kind of traditional West African approach to parenting, where children were not just the property of the biological parents, but were raised communally to a significant extent, and it was normal for a child to live and be raised by people who were not the biological parents, because parenthood was seen in a much more expansive way. And so Grantoya really does a lot of mothering in this story to Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And I thought that was quite wonderfully told. The next theme is clearly that of warrior. Grantoya is the warrior. She is an actual warrior, takes up arms. We see her train as a warrior. We see her defend her king, and then we see her bring that warrior approach to Haiti and to her status as an enslaved woman. Even though she might be enslaved, she exercises whatever power she can. She's always fighting the forces of enslavement and of whiteness in one way or another. The same thing goes for Marie Claire. She is somebody who does not give up, and she is depicted in that way as somebody who is always fighting whatever way she can, because she is a woman at one point married to a white man in Haiti. There are boundaries that she's not supposed to cross, and yet she challenges those boundaries at every step of the way, kind of doing the work of mothering, not just to her biological children, but to people she finds in need. One of the things that Marie Claire Bonheur was famous for was feeding the poor and the hungry throughout the period of the Haitian Revolution, and we get to see that in this story. I thought that was really important to tell, and how people contribute to a revolution, to warfare in many ways. That doesn't always have to involve physical fighting. You can still contribute, and everybody kind of has a role to play in a revolution like this one, especially one that encompasses so many decades. Like, it really must have felt never ending to the people that lived through the Haitian Revolution, because it was. The book also doesn't shy away from talking about the brutality of the Haitian Revolution, not just when it comes to slavery, but also to what Haitian generals had to do when fighting Napoleon and dealing with the white population in Haiti. There was the population in Haiti was so racially structured that it really becomes a necessity from the point of view of the Haitian rebels, especially the Black Haitian rebels, that whiteness cannot, it has to be eliminated, and that involves really massacring a lot of white people, including women and children. And that is like that is not hidden away, it is part of it. And Riley, I think, does a good job in terms of giving us that Haitian perspective about why this is necessary. The other main theme, especially in the second half of the story, and particularly in the last third, is that of sacrifice. What are you willing to sacrifice for your beliefs, for the greater good? Through most of the story, our main characters are not always together. There's so many things that separate all of these people from their loved ones, from their significant others, from the men and women that they are in love with. And that is a sacrifice, a time away. But for many of these characters, it is seen as a necessary sacrifice for ending slavery in Haiti. One of the other complexities of the Haitian Revolution is the way in which different Haitian rebel groups switch alliances, because at the same time that the Haitian Revolution is happening, the French Revolution is happening in France, and then France engages in a war with the rest of the European powers. So there's this larger war going on that comes to the Caribbean through these European powers, because the Spanish, the English, the French are all hold colonies in the Caribbean, and so the European war has a Caribbean theater, and we get to see that, how it affects the people of Haiti and the rebels themselves, because they're still in the middle of a revolution. They're also in the middle of a lot of internal turmoil and disagreement about what the correct path towards freedom is, especially amongst the Black rebels and the kind of mixed race rebels, right? They represented two different interest groups with very different goals. For a lot of the mixed race rebels, for example, ending slavery was not necessarily the priority. Gaining more rights was the priority. Whereas for Black revolutionaries in Haiti, the main and predominant goal was ending slavery. Then, as the revolution progresses, you add on further goals, because once it becomes clear that not only can they, but they are achieving their goals, then things expand. And then later, the whole political and social situation in Haiti changes because Napoleon comes to power. And he has very different goals. And so this is just like a glimpse of the complexities that Riley had to put up with. As a result of all these complexities, there are times in which the narrative doesn't necessarily flow as easily. Right, you're in the middle of somebody's perspective, and then you think like, wait, all of a sudden this dramatic change occurred, and I wanted to see more of how this change occurred. But the reality was that, like, Riley, because her story encompasses decades and decades of so much change, sometimes has to gloss over or skip a detailed description of particular things. That's going to be a little bit jarring for some people, but I think overall it kind of works. There were times in which some of those jumps didn't always work for me, but overall the narrative worked. I also am noticing that Riley is experimenting a lot with just the narrative telling of stories. I noticed that in her first historical fiction book, and now with Sister Mother Warrior as well. And I like that. That's fantastic. I love when I see writers playing with elements like that. Sometimes it means it doesn't work though, and still I think I have a great appreciation for when writers try to play with different styles of writing and different narrative styles for telling their stories. So just a heads up that it might not work for you necessarily the way that Riley tells the story, but I think it's a really important story, and it's a book that's worthwhile of picking up and seeing if it'll work for you, especially if you don't know much or you know very little the Haitian Revolution. I think you'll learn quite a bit here, and I don't think you need to know a lot about the Haitian Revolution coming in. If you do know some of the history, there's going to be, like, you'll get an additional pleasure out of the story, because Riley clearly knows her history really, really well. Like, Riley is just amazing in the way she tackles historical periods. Her bibliography at the end of this book is amazing. Like, just really, really amazing. And so you will gain a lot if you know your history from reading the book, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary, because Riley focuses the story through the eyes of these particular women. So ultimately we're looking at the lives of these women. And so like I said, I think it's a book worth reading. So if you have read this book, or if you're planning on reading this book, please leave a comment down below and let me know. I'm always happy to talk about these books. I love talking about this history with anyone and everyone. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.